So I thought it'd be fun to just quickly go over my collection of games and my favorite books. And the reason why am doing this and the reason why I started a YouTube channel is not to show off and say, oh, this is what I have. My collection, compared to so many people out there, is not very big or anything like that, not very unique or impressive. But the reason I want to show it to you in its totality is so that you can get an idea of what I am like as a DM and the sorts of philosophies, I guess, and games that I really enjoy playing. And I want to do that because I'm trying to find more of a community and find more people to play with. So let's just kind of get to it. The first on the shelf here, I'm not going to go every one in detail, but I just wanted to show you a couple of unique ones and a cat. There's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I really like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay just because of the tone of it. I've always liked the kind of world of old Warhammer, even though I'm pretty new to the Warhammer universe and more familiar with, 40K and stuff like that. That was always interesting to me. There's some cool art in there. There's not a lot of stuff in that book I would use, but I just really enjoy flipping through it for ideas and things like that. Over here, you also can't see I've got Swords and Wizardry. That's one of the first OSR games I played with a couple of friends. Really enjoyed that one. I don't have a tremendous... Oops. Oh, gosh. I don't have a tremendous amount to actually say about it, except that it's a really good interpretation of, the old Dungeons and Dragons. Really easy to use. Has ascending AC in there and stuff like that. To make it a little bit more user-friendly. I also used to have Basic Fantasy, but I gave that away to somebody just because Swords and Wizardry is more my thing. I've got a reprint of the Rules Cyclopedia for Dungeons and Dragons next to that. I'm not going to get much into that one. That is really just a collection of all the old Dungeons and Dragons rules. The book actually came out many, many years ago, but is sort of high in demand. And they're very expensive, prohibitively expensive to get an older copy in many cases. So Drive-Thru RPG decided to reprint that. And along with that reprint, I'll just show you one of these. It's the sort of anniversary collection of AD&D, except that this player's handbook here and this monster manual here are also Drive-Thru RPG reprints. Whereas the Dungeon Master's Guide, this is actually direct from Wizards of the Coast. So I just got them as I was able to find them, basically. One has sort of gold edges to it, but they're the same books. The PDFs are the same. And then we have the newer stuff, the Advanced Player's Guide and Core Rulebook for Pathfinder 2e. I'm learning that system now. I'm really enjoying what I'm seeing. Even from the last video, or since the last video I did where I talked a bit about Pathfinder, I'm discovering that it is sort of defying my expectations of it. I've had it run for me, and I've played in a couple of games, and that set the bar for me for what I thought it was. But I've realized that it really is not all that dependent on grids. You could run it exactly like people run 5e Theater of the Mind if you want. And that's heartening because I prefer to kind of do a mix for my own sessions. We have Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG next to that. I am not going to pull it out, but I really, really highly recommend taking a look at that book. Just for reference, I'll pull out the DCC Annual, which maybe not a lot of people have seen. The Annual contains a lot of neat stuff in it. Weapons and spells. I guess the plan is to put this out, one of these out once every year. I don't know if they're actually going to be able to do once a year, but it's just kind of a collection of extra material. Completely unnecessary, but really wonderful. There's one section in here, for example, the stash, magic mustaches for Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG. I mean, you have mustache battles, basically, with other mustachioed fighters. You can sense each other based on your mustaches. Really, really fun stuff. Then we've got the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition collection. That's my most nostalgic version of the game, so I do collect books for that. I've got the main three: the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, Monster's Manual. Then you got Tome of Magic, Book of Artifacts, Legends of Lore. Nifty little books to have. We have XDM, that's the Extreme Dungeon Mastery Guide. This is really highly lauded by Professor Dungeon Master of Dungeon Craft. He talks a lot about that book. I was able to get this copy really cheaply way back when. I think they're like impossible to find or out of print now. So I'm lucky to have that one. And it's reasonable. I've used a few things in that book. Then we've got, of course, 5e. Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, a whole bit. And then just a couple of notable mentions. I have this little gem here, Diablo 2, The Awakening, which is a second edition AD&D Diablo module. It's meant to represent Diablo 2, but the dungeon layouts feel more like Diablo 1. I've got BX, the basic rule book for Dungeons & Dragons. That's a good one, obviously. One of the best, maybe the best, depending on who you ask. We've got a couple things here like Starfinder Beginner's Guides, Pathfinder Beginner's Guides, Complete Wizard's Handbook for 2nd edition, The Art of Dungeons & Dragons, which I like, a couple Dragon magazines, a reprint of the Fiend Folio as well from Drive-Thru RPG. And then the last one I'll really spend any time talking about is one of my favorite recently, and that's Mork Borg, or Mork Borg, however you want to say it, or Mork Borg. Don't think it matters. But I mean, this is just insane as a heavy metal fan, for one thing. This scratches every possible itch in my body for sort of darker roleplay. I mean, I'll just show you a couple of pages of what this looks like. The whole thing is just, it's a work of art. Even if you use nothing about the system here. And the system is great. It's really, really simple. It's like one spread for all of combat and how that works. My favorite part, and I think most people's favorite part, is the calendar of Nethrubel. And what this is it's a series of psalms. To give you an example, 2:1, as at the beginning, so at the end, all manner of fly and wasp shall fill the air. The idea is you roll a dice each game day. The dice size depends on how long you want this game to realistically go. It can be as low as a D2. And every time you roll a 1, you will read one of these psalms and then somehow integrate that into the game world, however you want to manifest that or interpret it. And what will happen is when you get to the 7th psalm, that's the final psalm, and basically the world ends, burn the book. It's meant to be a really dark, sort of brutal experience. And as evidence here, this is what I was kind of looking for from the beginning. This is the page on combat called Violence. Makes sense. So these are the kinds of games that I enjoy playing. I mean, to me, I have Starfinder in there as well somewhere. I've got Mouse Guard and Troika. But I stick to pretty conventional fantasy-oriented games, and all of them pretty much in the same genre or the same wheelhouse of thought. I also have Old School Essentials, which is a recreation of old D&D. I mean, what do I like about all of this is just, that's the world, that was the game to me growing up. That was RPGs. That was Dungeons and Dragons. It was all about Dungeons and Dragons. I didn't grow up playing Cthulhu or Shadowrun or have any real experience with any of these games. I had someone introduce me to GURPS, but I didn't really get into it, and Rifts and a couple of games like that. But these were the main ones. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, especially the 2nd edition. There is something so fundamentally nostalgic about that for me. I have the other stuff because of its history and because I enjoy reading what's in there, and I do use some of the stuff that's in the old book still as well. To me, the Dungeon Master's Guide of the 1st edition, you could use that in any system and you'd get along just fine, right? But these are the kinds of games I like to play. I'm open to anything, and I'm open to run just about anything. And I think that if you read enough of these books, you do get to a point where it all kind of starts to feel the same. even if you jump to another system like, say, Cyberpunk or Cthulhu or Shadowrun, something that maybe uses percentiles or roll unders or d6s, whatever, you kind of get the same sense that, well, I could convert this over to anything. You know, I could take the stuff out of this book and put it over here, patch it in here. And that's what I love about the hobby. It's so hackable as a dungeon master. I can create my own complete game out of existing games if I want to do that, or I can just run the systems as is. And most of them are reasonable enough, doing, raw, as they call it, which I can never remember the exact acronym. Rules as written. So you can run any of these that way, but it's really fun to play around with the differences. And, is it necessary to have 4 different versions of Dungeons and Dragons? Absolutely not. Is it fun to be able to pick and pull from each one, or just open a book on a rainy day and look at that familiar artwork and, just kind of enjoy the presence and the tone of the different books? Because they're all tonally very different and they're all structurally very different. And it's neat to see that evolution from the oldest days of D&D, when it was just, one little basic rule book, essentially, or several, depending on what version you had. And now, these massive tomes and different things, and going into OSR now, much smaller books like Mork Borg. I mean, that's a complete game, and there's not much here. That's one book. The character sheet is like almost half empty. There's so much white space on it, because these games are getting more minimalist now as we move into the post D&D era, I guess, the post convoluted 3.0 era. And don't get me wrong, I actually grew up with 3.0 as well. It was the first set of books I actually owned. And, Pathfinder I find interesting. I find 3.0 interesting. I find it insanely verbose, far more than it needs to be. And even when I ran it as a kid, I stripped it down to the bare bones. But, different strokes for different folks. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what I kind of like as a DM and as a player. And as you can see, I'm pretty much a one-trick pony. I do enjoy the odd weird thing, Mork Borg, that sort of dark horror, dark fantasy sensibility. Love that stuff. Troika, just because it's so strange and out there. And then Mouse Guard. I only really own Mouse Guard, frankly, because of the art. The artwork is incredible, and I love the comic books as well. They're really cool. I like to read them with my kids. But anyway, I'm going to stop it there. Thanks for dropping by. If you're into the same kind of things, leave a comment. I'd love to get some people together, start playing some more games. Catch you later.